Pad 700. The term paper for this course is a variant of a policy analysis, right? There are many forms of policy analysis, but I wanted to create this slide deck for those that may not be familiar with policy analysis. Before watching this video, I encourage you to review the prompt for the term paper. So there's three prompts for part 1, 2, and 3. Review all three, and then I think these slides would make sense to you. And let's go into detail. So first I'm going to talk about problem statements, then we'll talk a little bit about policy questions, and then how to formulate policy options. Let's begin. So for problem statements, you should be brief, and the statement itself should also be focused. What I mean by brief is when you first start designing the problem statement, you want to have one sentence or a fragment that is pretty illustrative. You'll have an opportunity in the paper to expound upon that, but if you can get it down to one sentence, then writing the problem statement and the rest of the term paper will be much easier for you. Now, we have a habit of providing backstory or injecting the solutions into the problem statement before the paper even begins. So I want you to avoid that. So your exercise here is to have targeted language that informs the reader of who the population and the jurisdiction that you will focus in on. So who is the population and where are they located in this world of ours? So if you take your eyes down to the bottom of the slide, you want to specify the scope and specify the population. That within itself, just working on those two items will help you narrow down your problem statement. So here are some examples. I chose the top three that people tend to write about. So homelessness, crime, and healthcare. Let's first deal with a homeless example. Increasing rates of youth homelessness in New York State. And you'll notice here the population is obviously youth who are homeless, and the jurisdiction is New York State. So if you just focus on those two things, the problem itself will be usually the first part of that fragment or the sentence, and then you'll give some illustrative scope descriptors rather. So the crime example, racial disparities in judicial decisions for blue-collar crime in Brooklyn. And notice these aren't like sentences per se. So it's okay to have a fragment when you're designing your ideas and jotting them down on paper for the first time. And then the healthcare example, higher rates of diabetes among veterans in the New York City area. So I'm going to take these examples forward when I talk about policy questions and policy options. But first, a few tips for designing suitable questions. Now, policy questions are very different from research questions. Research questions tend to be very finite in scope. Policy questions attempt to address big problems and tackle problems that address large numbers of people. And for that reason, you need to be broad and leave room for exploration beyond the scope that you're focusing on. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. You want to avoid embedding possible solutions to the problem. And what I mean by that is that sometimes people will state the question with already providing the solution in the question. So be conscious of what you're writing down on paper when you're formulating your question. And try not to jump to the end of the process and have all of the answers or reveal all of your biases as you're drafting your question. You want to avoid the normative stance. If your question starts with, should there be free healthcare or should anything, you're basically just juxtapositioning two parties or two arguments against each other before exploring what the landscape has to offer in terms of the debate. So avoid getting into yin-yang framing when you're designing your policy question. Typical questions that start with how or what will definitely reveal facts because it allows you to stay in exploratory mode versus choosing a side early on. So this slide really doesn't talk about bias, but everything to help you avoid bias is on this slide. Often we pick topics that we're passionate about, and we've already made up our mind about what the solution should be. For this term paper, you need to work hard at not doing that, because your job is to report the facts, not opinions, not your stance or arguments that you agree with only, but to really capture the landscape of the debate and report that in your term paper. And the last one I'll cover here is avoid listing multiple research questions. So remember I talked about research questions being specific, and so sometimes we'll get in the habit of asking 4 or 5 questions and thinking that that's our policy question, or we're struggling with settling on one question, so we'll list 5. So avoid that. That's a research strategy. It works if you're writing a research paper, a traditional research paper. Here you're conducting a different type of research in that your question is broader than your typical research project. Now, some suitable examples of policy questions. I brought forward some of the problem statements that I showed you in the earlier slides. So let's just tackle the first one. So the first problem statement example I provided was increasing rates of youth homelessness in New York State. So a suitable example of that is just really rephrasing that into a question. What are the most feasible strategies for addressing youth homelessness in New York State? So as you survey the debate or the landscape of the problem, you may go beyond New York State and look to see what Connecticut is doing in terms of youth homelessness. Or you may look at California. So this is about the available strategies and examples that are out there for you. And the way this question is framed, it doesn't limit you to just looking at what's happening and what's being done in New York State. I'll just skip forward to the third scenario here. Higher rates of diabetes among veterans in New York City is the problem statement or the topic that we're focusing on. And so the suitable example would be, which available responses to diabetes will help address similar issues with veterans who live in New York City? So again, a bit of a play on words, but once you nail down what your topic is using that strategy of scoping down to the population and scoping down to the jurisdiction, you really just have to wrap the problem around those two elements. Now, I just wanted to show you a few bad examples of policy questions. And the reason why these are bad examples is because they're really like survey questions or questions you would use to conduct a research project. Should we get rid of Obamacare? So those irritating folks that you may see on the street that want to survey you and ask you questions for the latest electoral polls or what have you, they may ask you that type of question. A policy analysis goes much broader than just opinions, right? Again, we're gathering facts. What is the relationship between homelessness and crime rates? If you're familiar with statistics, you know that you could run a regression and answer this question fairly quick. It doesn't take a term paper to answer that type of question. It's very specific and finite. Which states allow immigrants to apply for a driver's license, right? All you have to do there is collect the 50 positions in the United States and draft that up fairly quickly. So again, it really doesn't get to the problem or solution. And most of our policy analysis are solution driven. And the last item here is policy options, how to design a policy option. First, allow me to try to define what that is for folks who have never conducted a policy analysis before. Sometimes it's referred to as policy solutions, policy alternatives, or policy strategies. Any of those terms, they're basically talking about policy options. So what you want to do is think about maybe going to the grocery store and creating a list of the things you need to feed your family. And so those are solutions. Your family's hungry. What do you need? What are those elements you need to feed them? Maybe you have a child that's lactose intolerant. So that might not be a feasible policy option. It will not make it on your laundry list. So think of in terms of what's available in the atmosphere, think as broad as possible, and then narrow that down to what's applicable to the focus that you're concerned about. And so that means you can look at other states. Maybe there are model cities in another country, and they're doing things better than maybe the state or city that you're focusing in on. You can use those models and bring them in and say, here's one option we could try to adopt for this particular problem. Now, that example that I'm giving you, say applying strategies that were applied to healthcare, to a housing context. So again, you're not confined to the context of the problem that you're focusing on. You can always look to see how other problems are being resolved in other areas. So again, be broad, be exploratory, think big, and that's the policy process. So I just want to give you a few examples, but I'm only going to bring forward the example about homelessness. I'm not going to go through all three of those examples. We had a problem statement of increasing rates of youth homelessness in New York State. Homelessness among young folks is increasing in New York State. And then the policy question, again, reframed, maintaining those two scopes of population and jurisdiction. What are the most feasible strategies for addressing youth homelessness in New York State? And so you've surveyed, you've gone out and you've looked at the journal articles that are out there. You've looked at what maybe Urban Institute has said about the issue you're interested in, or maybe a think tank that focuses on strictly homelessness. You've surveyed news stories. You've brought all of that information in, and you've come to the conclusion or a short list of about 3 or 4 policy options, which should be your baseline, your target number of policy options for any analysis. You should never have a laundry list of 1 or 2 options, but try to aim for 3 or 4. And often the first one, do nothing, should show up in every policy analysis. So in your term paper, hint, hint, your first policy option is to have no change at all, stasis. Don't do anything. And because that tells you a little bit about the baseline of the other that you would compare these other strategies to. So policy option 2 here says adopt elements from Seattle and San Francisco SRO strategies to shelter youth. So again, think beyond the bounds that you're concerned about, and that could include cities, states, and other countries. And then policy option 3 says increase the city's budget for SRO units. Now, policy option 4, although it's not listed here, could be a combination of policy option 2 and 3, right? So you're not bound by these options. You just need to at least have that list and then start working through what's the most rational, most feasible response to the problem. I hope these slides help. And if you have additional questions, make sure you reach out to me